Welcome everybody to our GA4GH Fireside Chat. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro first, and then I'll introduce our speaker as well here, Tim Hubbard in full. But just to say that I'm Serena Scollen. I'm Head of Human Genomics and Translational Data at the ELIXIR Hub. And I'm also coordinator of the 1+ Million Genome Initiative projects, the Beyond 1 Million Genome Plus, and the European Genomic Data Infrastructure Project. But to give you a little bit of a background about ELIXIR, not everyone's familiar with the organisation. We're an intergovernment organisation. We connect the national bioinformatics centres and EMBL EBI into a sustainable infrastructure in Europe for biological research data. And the intention here is that this infrastructure really makes it easier for scientists to find and share data, also to share expertise and to agree on best practices. So ultimately, then this will lead us to really understanding how living organisms work. And specifically for genomics, we've been building infrastructure and capacity for genomic data for over a decade. So we're working here towards improving discoverability, access, sharing, analysis of genomic data, and linking it to other data types at scale. So the impact then in the long run will be that we'll demonstrate that genomics research is really translating into medicine, and ELIXIR will have a huge part to play in that because of the improvements in the data infrastructure for genomic data. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through, because our speaker here, Tim, has a lot of experience with that. But just to show the connection with GA4GH, we closely align and work together with GA4GH. The two organisations come together collaboratively and complementary with activities in order to establish and implement standards and design tools to overcome some of the technical and regulatory hurdles that then aid genomic data sharing. So GA4GH do this on more of an international scale. ELIXIR predominantly does this on a European scale. And we have a strategic partnership in place. It's been in place for a number of years now, where we really work together on these complementary activities. And we also have a driver project. So within GA4GH, there are these driver projects. The European Genomic Data Infrastructure Project is one of those. And so that link comes together, and today I'm actually here as a GA4GH Strategic Leadership Committee, and that's why I'm chairing this Fireside Chat. And I'm joined by Professor Tim Hubbard. So Professor Tim Hubbard is an ELIXIR director, and he brings with him a wealth of scientific, technical, and management experience to this area. He's also a professor of bioinformatics at King's College London in the Department of Medical and Molecular Genetics. He was previously a senior advisor at Genomics England and associate director of the London region of Health Data Research UK, HDR UK. Before that, he was also head of informatics at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, which is where I first knew him. And he is one of the organisers there of sequencing the human genome. So an ideal person to give us some of the history here in the genomics era and how we've come to where we are today with the infrastructure that we're providing. He's obviously championed over the years open science, responsible data sharing, ethical implementation of genomics, and more recently he was appointed as the World Health Organization Technical Advisory Group, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about that as we move through this next hour as well. So just to get to the end of my intro, this session is going to be very informal. It's going to be very conversational. You'll hear a lot less from me and a lot more from Tim as we move through. We'll talk about his journey, explore trends in genomics, and obviously have time for Q&A. So if you do want to ask a question, feel free to put that into the chat and I'll refer back and hopefully be able to get to some of those questions before the end. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Serena.
I've got through my blurb. So we'll start off with some questions around your background and career evolution and let you introduce yourself a little bit more. So let's start with discussing how did you first come into the world of genomics, and share us a little bit about the interests you had and how you led you to the Human Genome Project.
So in short, I was kidnapped. I was really a structural biologist for my PhD and postdoc after that at the MRC in Cambridge, and before that in Birkbeck College London. And, you know, I was doing the protein structure prediction problem protein design, things like that, and was looking for a group leader position. And just down the road from MRC in Cambridge, of course, there's the new Sanger Institute, and they were advertising. And so I was looking for structural genomics group leader position. And they said, yes, well, but maybe you'd like this slightly more senior position, and it would just involve looking after the analysis of the human genome, and it won't take up any of your time, is the exact quote. And of course, I never did any structural genomics after structural biology after that. I was just completely swallowed by the Human Genome Project. But very, very lucky, I think, a lucky event in career.
Definitely. And that's an exciting time because obviously it was the sequencing of the human genome that really transferred and moved us into this next genomics era. So you obviously stayed here, you enjoyed the genomics era. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the points that really come to mind over that course of time?
I mean, I joined Sanger in 1997. That was really when the human genome sequencing was just getting started. And we didn't have, we hadn't done the scale up really at that stage. The Celera came on the horizon. I mean, this is a long time ago now, 25 years ago. Not everybody knows about the competition between public domain versus commercial and whether the human genome was going to be in the public domain or not. And even if it was in the public domain, did you have resources for using that data, because it was in millions and millions of fragments. So building databases, building infrastructure like the Ensemble project, which I was the co-founder with Ewan and Michelle Clamp, which of course is still running today and is one of the underpinning ways of getting access to the human genome and eventually genomes in general. So all of that was there to be built at that stage, alongside, of course, a huge scale-up process. I mean, literally, moving, if you look at the graph during 1999, we went from a few percent to 100, close to 100% of the original human genome sequenced, working out then as we went along how to put that together and also how to annotate it in sort of computationally, at least initially, but also with a large number of annotators. And we've still got annotators. The GenCode project came after that. It became clear you couldn't predict where human genes are directly. Even with mRNA, it's hard to do that, to build gene structures without curation on top of that. So the reference, building these systems to allow you to both computationally annotate at scale, but also back that up with curation to produce a reference that other people can build on.
And if you look back to your former self back in 1999, would you have thought that we'd be where we are now, or do you think we'd be further ahead, or what was your prediction back then, if you can recall?
So I think the most transformational thing was we did the human genome and we couldn't afford to do the mouse genome afterwards. The mouse genome was sort of sitting around for a while. We tried, there was an international project to do it at a rough level because we didn't have the money, because, the first human cost, 3 billion is the number posted around, but it was a lot of money. So we weren't even sure we could afford to do individual reference genomes. And of course, next generation sequencing came along and everything got transformed. And within a few years, it became clear that you could start thinking about individual genomes for healthcare, as an affordable thing to deliver. And so, first, of course, you had to collect background information like the variation nature of the genome, the 1,000 Genomes Project, all these various projects collecting large-scale data, but thinking along the lines of, could you do genomes in healthcare? And so that's where I went next after Sanger. I had been involved in a lot of the policy discussions in the UK over a number of years. I mean, I think we first started contributing to the House of Lords report at Sanger, the leadership team, in about 2008 or something like that. And, the policy, this decision to sequence 100,000 in the NHS rather than as a research project, that was a very clear direction of UK government, because the Prime Minister was determined that this would be a health service project. that decision wasn't made until the end of 2012. So you can see how long the policy discussions take to make that sort of impact. And now, of course, we have a genome medicine service and the health service in the UK based on whole genome sequencing for rare disease and cancer.
Yeah, and actually looking now across the European landscape, it's really an injection of that policy plus a massive investment of cash and drive that can move those national programs forward. But then excitingly, you joined ELIXIR, 18 months ago now. So you were involved with ELIXIR from early stage when it was formed, but then obviously came back to direct us a few years ago. Can you explain a little bit more about ELIXIR for those that are less familiar, why it was created and where it's going to get us in that landscape now?
So in the long background, because this is another committee, so I was doing the human genome committees in the UK, but then there was this European committee for basically biological resources at the time of the S3 roadmap in 2006. And so this was, pushed by Fotis Kafatos to make sure that biology got into these infrastructure roadmaps, because up to that point it was purely physics, really, synchrotrons, space telescopes, things like that. And in fact, there was quite a push from that community saying, biology is not big enough, it's not serious enough to need infrastructures. And so this was to, a group of us forming this committee tasked with, coming up with the first proposals for projects, because we knew from, the position of the UBI, for example, just handling the single human genome and all the data coming on afterwards, it was clear that the resourcing wasn't enough, and it just didn't have the right recognition at a kind of national or European level. So that committee put those 6 projects initially onto the roadmap, and one of them became ELIXIR. And because of the structure of a distributed system with national nodes, it actually catalyzed the idea that biology infrastructure actually need to be on national roadmaps as well. So I think it's done, that train that started, has done a lot of good in terms of government science funding across the European Union, recognizing the importance, the growth of this data. The sequencing just gets another biological data collection methods just get cheaper and cheaper, and it becomes clear that you get more and more value out of collecting. I mean, talking to the former director of Sanger, when the last review they had, the question was, what are you going to be doing in 25 years? Well, probably we'll still be sequencing, because, doesn't matter what it is, now you want to sequence it. And you don't just want to sequence organisms, you want to sequence biodiversity, you want to sequence individual cells, you want to look at variation and time courses across all these things. And all of that is accessible now. But then you've got to be able to handle the data at that sort of scale. And of course, you see large scale data usage by places like CERN. We're in that category now as well. In fact, you could argue that our data is more complex and harder to handle than some of the streamed data collection for physics.
Yeah, but I think excitingly, the genomics field really started this collaboration with the genome-wide association studies and being able to access data collaboratively and collect it. But I think for me, the big difference with ELIXIR is that having that data for other uses, so obviously if it's a breast cancer cohort, it's predominantly then being used for breast cancer research, but being able to get data at scale is going to be a game changer in my view. So hopefully that will take us through the next 25 years and drive some of the personalized medicine approaches and impact into healthcare. Wondering if you could share your thoughts on generally open data sharing and more sort of advanced and complicating genomics. What's the value in that data and having that sustainable infrastructure in place?
So I guess the big transformation, the human genome reference was, famously open, and in fact drove quite a lot of the policy around pre-publication research, making things more open, trying to reduce barriers to researchers using each other's data, even when it wasn't very tidy or clean and hadn't gone through publication. But now well, actually the source of most of that data in the future, at least in humans, is probably going to be healthcare. That's where genomes are going to get sequenced, paid by healthcare. But then can you get access to that or not? And, that's been a battle, not for genomes, but for healthcare records as long as I can remember. I was involved in discussions about what could be done about this. And I think now we actually do have a mechanism for do that in secure environments, trusted research environments, secure processing environments. The concept that you don't try and anonymize data to death and then distribute it, because you can never anonymize it enough to protect individuals, especially with all the other information you potentially can combine with it outside. But instead, you don't distribute it, but you allow people to access and compute over it within a secure structure. That's been the way that social science has operated for decades, when data is sensitive. But the genomics world is, large-scale computing and large-scale data, different sort of size. So, Genomics England was one of the first where you actually had to do that because these were not research subjects. They were, individual patients in the NHS with unmet clinical need. Different world. They could agree to let people analyze their data, but not in the same way as a research cohort. So the infrastructure has been built in the UK for a single centralized system. The challenge now for 1 million genomes and to do this across Europe and potentially in the long term across the world is you're going to have to do that in a distributed way, where you have a federated system of doing analysis, where you don't move the data around, but you do the analysis in different secure environments and combine that. And of course, that's where GDI is, which is an ELIXIR project managed by ELIXIR, and projects like EOSC Trust, working out how to do that kind of secure federated computing. So I think that the way computing has gone with cloud computing, containerization, portability of algorithms has made that technically possible. But we still have to do quite a lot of work to make that really work in practice.
So from your perspective, the technology is accelerating. We're nearly ready to upscale, but it's really the policy that's lagging.
I think the policy now is done. I mean, but the European Union under the European Health Data Space regulation kind of recognizes all this. And in the UK, it was announced as government policy. We're not going to distribute data anymore. We're going to provide access as a switch for health service data and sensitive data in general. And I think you see even research cohorts like UK Biobank switching over to that model because of kind of increased worry of research participants that actually distributing it isn't really the best thing if you want to protect people's privacy in today's age. But I think you can make this work now. So as far as a policy instrument now being implemented in practice.
So from that perspective, then, do you feel that the citizens are ready for this? You talk about research participants, and obviously there's difference between the general population. Maybe from your Genomics England background, can you compare between the rare disease patients to maybe cancer patients because of the unmet need in certain aspects of both of those? There's a difference view, and of course then you have the general citizens as well. If you've got any insights? So
I've done a load of deliberative engagement processes, the NHS level as well, health service, UK Health Service, and across Genomics England. So those different groups, as you say, of course, rare disease patients, cancer patients, they have a slightly different perspective about reuse of their data. But the biggest study of this type we did was 2 weekends with 100 Londoners discussing what they thought would be acceptable for using of their normal health service data. So just patient data, they're not necessarily ill. In fact, this 100 group has turned themselves into an advisory group for secure environments in London. And I guess I would say the take home, that report's available. You can go read what they concluded. It's deliberative engagement. So it's not like, discussing what we're going to do. It's them saying what they think is the right balance, particularly with things like commercialization. But from the point of view of secure environments, it very much is, if you promise not to distribute people's data, they're much more comfortable. And the biggest risk, as perceived by these groups, seems to be, I don't want companies to have a copy and then start using that to send me advertisements or to block me from things. And, that used to be a kind of threat that nobody really thought was real until, at least for UK people listening, until Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, where it turned out people's data was going to influence their political voting, which was a scandal. And people now point to that and say, yes, it really does happen.
Yeah, and then obviously the forward thinking, or people that have gone into 23andMe, and then there's been issues there.
Yeah.
The company, and then being taken over by a larger company potentially. I can't remember the latest. I think it's going back now to 23andMe. But anyway, yeah, that also causes problems, doesn't it, for the general citizen? We need to do a lot more.
That is an interesting one. I mean, I'm a 23andMe participant, and there was a point they were actually operating a secure environment, just like Genomics England, really in the early days, quite strictly. That then there was a point where they asked if they could distribute the data to some companies, and you had a choice of whether to say yes or no. So from that point of view, they followed, fairly reasonable route, I think, in terms of asking people and not, changing the rules arbitrarily.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, moving back to Europe. So ELIXIR is obviously focused primarily on Europe. What do you think is the main selling point for in the genomics in the healthcare space within that European sphere as opposed to the rest of the world?
So obviously, if we're going to improve healthcare and, also look at just how, environmental impact on health, social impact on health, you need to be able to look at records in real time. And the European health data space regulation, by basically saying that countries are all obliged to set that in place with secure processing environments, I think it's going to open up a lot of opportunity for working out how you can improve healthcare delivery. And of course, individual countries, there are effects, seeing patterns such as, new COVID infections or something like that. That sort of surveillance, if you've got access to all that data, you can spot patterns. And so the power is the very large population. Even sort of smallish effects, you ought to be able to see them across those records. Obviously, there's a huge amount to do in terms of standardization, interoperability, but I think it's going to be just good for healthcare across Europe. And of course, the genomic side, we're, everywhere. We're some way off from genomes connected to every patient. It will only be for specific cases, at least initially. But the prices, the cost value for healthcare improvement, will progressively mean that it becomes more of a default for patients, I think.
Yeah, so strong public healthcare systems, opportunities for population level implementation.
Yeah.
GDPR, so that's really a thoughtful governance model that's brought some challenges as well, but it's quite unique to Europe, isn't it? And from my perspective, the 1+million genome initiative as well, where we're coming together, the political drive to move towards access to data, corresponding clinical data, as well as the genomics. I think that will bring groundbreaking research for Europe and position us really nicely in the global efforts as well.
And it's not just the healthcare data and genomics data. The concept of the European Union is data spaces. It's to do this across all kinds of different sectors, the environment, biodiversity, pollution. There's a whole set range planned. And I think it becomes a very generalized mechanism for, policy-based research, linking how do you deliver and how do you improve society with data. And I think that, the European Union, with its regulatory structure, GDPR has been copied worldwide. It has become the default standard, and it has sort of straightened out a lot of issues which really were buried inside companies, particularly also in academic sectors. I think it's actually a very strong model for future economic growth in the European Union.
Yeah, I'd agree. One of ELIXIR's goals is obviously trying to make this happen, allow researchers to then use or find data in the first place and use that data. Can you share an example where ELIXIR's really made that vision real? We've been in the genomics field for a decade, obviously in a large growth space, and developed a number of services in this time. Some of them have been working alongside GA4GH. Is there anything that really comes to mind as being a big impact in that space?
So I think there's obviously the GDI, which is under construction, genome data infrastructure, but part of the, what ELIXIR has been doing is this lowering the standardization and lowering the barriers for, a large range of different tools and resources, so that it is possible to make them more interoperable. So you have, modern structures like Workflow Hub, containerized tools, standardized workflows that are easier to deploy. And then you have things like, this is not an ELIXIR project, Galaxy, but it's something that, ELIXIR is strongly supported. There's a community around it. And of course, that becomes a graphical front end to doing a lot of these types of analysis, which is easier to operate. From my experience with Ensemble, you can do very complicated command line analysis with those data sets, but a lot of people want to ask a simple question, get started. They're not bioinformaticians directly. So having a strong, easier to use website or, graphical front end is really important to, lower the barrier to entry for doing analysis. I've watched bioinformatics grow. I've been in this field for 40 years, and it wasn't called bioinformatics. The first meetings at the center at EMBL in Heidelberg, biocomputing was the sort of early name. Things have grown up since that time. You've now got 500,000 biological researchers across Europe. You can't nowadays be a researcher in this space without doing data analysis. And not everybody's got a computer training. So you want to make it as easy as possible for people to do, productive, reliable analysis. And so the whole ELIXIR space of thousands of bioinformaticians across the nodes, building tools and making them more easy to use. I think that's one of the major sort of, coordinating that, making it more standard is one of the major outputs.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And it's hard to know how to define what a bioinformatician is because it's such a broad term these days. But one of the...
Everyone's a bioinformatician these days.
Yeah,
or should be.
One of the first projects I got involved in was one with GA4GH and DNA Stack, the Beacon Discovery Service, before your time in ELIXIR. That one to me was really exciting because we invested heavily to develop that discovery service. It's now the front end of some of the work with workflows in GDI. So that to me is one of the connections with GA4GH that I think as a European effort has really come along and been sustained, which means it is obviously a needed service as well. But also along the lines of ethics and trust, data privacy, interoperability. We've put in place frameworks, I think obviously across ELIXIR, we've worked on AAI and other GDPR-aware technical frameworks. So I think we're moving towards also federated EGA and trusted sharing concrete examples of that. So I think we're really moving forward in the ELIXIR, in the European space. Moving then towards more globally, so the global impact and bringing back GA4GH a little bit more. So what role do you think GA4GH really plays today in this arena?
I think this is, it has existed for a long time and has brought together people in this space, across the world, really, 500 and nearly 600 different organizations or individuals are part of it. I think I can't remember how many countries it is now, but it's really is a global enterprise. And these standards bodies really are important. It's interesting. Some of the standards you listed as products are actually file standards, where these files were originally developed by organizations like Sanger Institute, for example. Some of the ones listed there came out of that, or they came out of the EBI, or they came out of NCBI in the States. But when you have something like that, you do need a body to kind of take charge of maintaining a standard, because it doesn't, maybe you never need to change it, maybe you never need to update it, but nearly always you do need to make subtle changes as technology evolves, sequencing technology or just implementation. And so to have a organization like GA4GH, which can kind of take control, take responsibility for keeping something up to date, is really important. Rather than relying on some institute where something was developed initially, where individuals may leave or may retire even, or the institute's direction may change and this standard may be orphaned. So I think that's an important side, but of course it's also developed a load of standards, developed a load of APIs, a lot of policy work. Those are all important deliverables to give something, that everybody, if they're doing this around the world, can look at and see that, look at a reference standard that is being broadly used. And I think GA4GH now is recognized pretty much everywhere. Peter came and talked to us at the WHO in the Technical Advisory Group as, one of the recognized organizations that if you're interested in, global deployment of genomics, you need to be linked to.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then anything specific that you feel have made a real difference? Any of the standards that sort of spring to mind of?
So I think the passport thing is one of the ones that come to mind. Beacons, obviously, which, because, that sort of distributed querying is a secure way, there were early ideas in that sort of space, and distributed annotations. I've been following that for years. But there's a very large number actually of products around very particular aspects that you have to consider. You need a kit to do this sort of stuff, and you don't actually realize how many components that you need of that kit if you're going to deploy genomics, implement genomics. And you've got a very comprehensive list under GA4GH of ways of doing things that can be a good starting point, or maybe the complete adoption by any new aspiring country or institute that wants to get into this space.
Yeah, definitely. So some of the barriers then that we need to overcome in the future, if we're looking towards global genomic research, we're often still in our silos. Even though we've got 26 countries in the 1+ million genome initiative, we've got a European silo. There's obviously countries that are further advanced and some that are trying to join in. What do you think that some of the biggest barriers are for us to really achieve that global research? Because we can't work in these silos, even though obviously there is that economic benefit and we're in some sort of competitive space. Genomics has to be global for it to be successful for multiple reasons. But
so if you're in the healthcare space, it's not competitive because, every country's got its own healthcare system delivering healthcare to its citizens. Those countries are not competing with each other. There's much more collaboration. Maybe research outputs leading to something that you can sell as economic benefit, but that's only part of the story. So in the WHO space, the barriers are really about healthcare systems and how mature they are. And on this technical advisory group, the main sort of drive for that is to make all countries aware of that, genomics is going to influence your healthcare system. And so it doesn't matter, what level, what state your healthcare system is, you need to have at least some people who are in this space who can advise and make sure that you take advantage of what genomics can offer, depending on, the specifics of your individual country's development and, disease profiles. There's something in it for everybody there, and that's, under the WHO system, it's making sure that message gets across, because it is now, cheap enough for many, many different settings, particularly for infection tracking, but also for, there's rare disease and cancer everywhere, making sure that, these things are accessible in terms of the kind of guidance, some of the guidance that's sitting in GA4GH documents. But, WHO, we put out a guideline of what you need to do to implement genomics, handle data sharing, all the different issues you need to think about if you're going down that route, and also supporting research analysis. And I really think there is an opportunity to link up globally, particularly build on what, in fact, we're building in Europe. We can make all those countries work together and federate their data. Then there's no reason why that can't be done globally as a model. It keeps control under individual countries, so they don't feel that this exploitation, that gives the opportunity for each country to build its own capacity for doing that analysis as well. And we're already seeing that, as part of the GDI implementation, many countries are using FEGA, Federated EGA, as a mechanism to start implementing that. And of course, there's FEGA installations now outside the European Union, and a lot of interest, including places like South Africa.
Yeah, definitely. So what would you suggest that GA4GH could learn from us at ELIXIR, or vice versa, whichever way comes to mind first?
Oh, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
I think we're quite closely linked at the hip, really. We're in similar sorts of space in terms of both implementation and standards and deployment. But yeah, I think one thing is GA4GH has clearly become well recognized, and I think that's it's gone over this period of time to where it really is seen as the standards body in this space, and that's something to learn from potentially.
Yeah. We're getting some questions into the Q&A. I'll come to those in a moment. We'll keep going for a little bit and come to those in hopefully about 5-10 minutes. But obviously, if you do have chat and questions, feel free to keep posting. You can put them into the webinar chat section as well. Just a last bit on this theme, Tim. Obviously, we're looking for sustainability at ELIXIR generally, but also GA4GH. So these communities, we work quite differently across GA4GH and ELIXIR, and how we sustain those communities and the different initiatives, projects, infrastructures. How is best to sustain these communities?
You're talking about financing. Of course, we're now living in a slightly shaken up world in terms of funding streams. I think that certainly in the European space, governments just have to recognize that they're going to have to support these kind of resources more than they did before, because many of the European resources did rely on US-based funding. I mean, it's across the other spaces, of course. European Union has the strategy around data really quite coherent and clear, and they are investing substantial amounts in things like AI factories, recognizing the impact that will have across industry as well as research, academic research. However, everything in that space relies on data. And if you don't invest enough in the underlying data resources, making sure that they can be linked to AI infrastructure, and that curation is critical as well, that's resourced as well. Curation is expensive, but we've seen examples of where it really leads to dramatic improvements. So I mentioned at the beginning that I was a structural biologist at the start before being kidnapped by Genomics. So one of the things I was doing there was I was one of the co-organizers of the CASP competition with John Malt for about 10 years. And that of course led eventually to AlphaFold, having a framework where you could evaluate who was making progress. Was anybody making progress in the problem, the 50-year-old problem of structure prediction? And that relied on having a set of robust experimental curated data, the PDB, Protein Data Bank, and that for that to be accessible by anybody who wanted to try and solve this problem. And DeepMind have recognized that the value of having that, both that resource but also that evaluation framework. So before we get sucked into an AI driven on AI, we get if you want to make sure that you can still evaluate things, you really need a robust curated data set in any space that you can refer to and make sure that you understand the provenance exactly, and that none of your data is actually really coming in a loop back from the AI itself. So the future really does rely on these resources. We can see if you look at economic benefits from the biomedical space, it's really it's really a growth industry. We're all getting older, or rather the profile of individuals across Europe is getting older across the world. More treatments are going to be needed. We want to live healthier for longer. And all of that relies on understanding biology better. And we're in a fantastic space with the rise of genomics and the frameworks to allow you to look at health records alongside that. But it's going to require some funding to underpin the resources that allow you to do that sort of analysis.
And we've got a number of questions coming in, so I think I'm going to be forced to obviously better questions than the ones I was going to ask you. So I'm going to move to some of the questions that we've got coming in live from our participants. One of them follows on from what you're saying around the AI and how that transforms genomic analysis, and questions: how can ELIXIR and GA4GH ensure that federated learning tools align with the ethical frameworks like GDPR? I don't know if you've got any thoughts around.
All right. So, I mean, I think the central thing there is this model of you don't distribute the data. You have this strong protection of individual. You want to be able to process individual data. That's the point. But once you distribute it, can you be sure that it's being kept private? So the solution right now, particularly when it comes to across national boundaries, is don't distribute it. Work out how you can process it effectively, run an algorithm in 27 different places, maybe more with regional structures in some countries, and combine the results. And we know that you can't do everything that way, but you can do a lot that way. So that's technically feasible now. To make that work requires some orchestration, some work, but I really think that that's a possible way to handle the benefits of individual level data without colliding with the protections of GDPR.
Yeah. So we move away from AI a little bit, but there's quite a few questions around your World Health Organization, or the hat that you wear in the technical advisory group there. So Noor has posted that it was a very informative discussion, but also wondering if there are initiatives focused on federated genomic data sets and research at the World Health Organization involving more of the low-income countries from the global south.
So, I mean, we've seen an aspect of that, not in the human genome space, but the pathogen genome space, where, the COVID history, the pandemic, countries, we need to see how the virus is evolving, which requires data collection across the world. That data needs to be shared somehow, but then individual countries worry about that the benefits are going to flow to other countries and not them. So there's always this balance between, I share my data, what's going to be the consequence for my country of doing that? So these sort of secure processing where you do distributed analysis may help with that. Countries may feel that they're less losing control of their own data, but you also need legal instruments. So you may have seen that the pandemic treaty was signed at WHO just recently after many years negotiations. So that's a step forward in terms of having multilateral frameworks are not very popular right now in the current framework, but I mean, I think it's good to see that even in the current world structure, new treaties like that can be agreed, at least from across the majority of countries of the world.
Yeah, definitely. And there's another one from the World Health Organization aspect. It's actually a really interesting question that's come in as well. I'll come to it in a moment, which is very thought-provoking. But while we're still on the World Health Organization, there's a comment saying that ELIXIR's training platforms are renowned. So could partnerships with GA4GH help to extend that expertise to low middle income countries through initiatives like the World Health Organization Technical Advisory Group? So maybe there's a bit of a plug there for you to get something into some of the outcomes.
Well, there's a very clear thing there, which actually is happening. So of course, training, there's training two sides. There's training about implementation in a healthcare setting. There's training around research. A lot of ELIXIR training is around, obviously, research. But inside the NHS, the health service in the UK, because we have done this 100,000 Genomes project and developed this genome medicine service, there a whole framework of training for healthcare professionals on the usage of genomic data got implemented. And there has been some international conferences that have been arranged, or workshops arranged through collaboration between the NHS and the WHO to basically broaden the understanding of those courses and accessibility of those courses, train the trainers type approaches, so that different countries can implement those sorts of training, that sort of modular training systems for their healthcare professionals. So there have been a couple of meetings for that. There was one in Athens quite recently with many, many countries sending representatives to learn about these approaches. So certainly the WHO is definitely a framework, although of course it's more on the research implementation side, the healthcare implementation side than the research side.
But that's exactly where things are blurring together now, isn't it? So that's
exactly, and one of the key things from having research and healthcare next to each other, don't separate those two, because then if the researchers find things about individuals that don't obviously know who anybody is, they may be able to send that message back to clinical care. Genomics England, more than 3,000 cases have been solved from the research side, extra research analysis beyond the standard pipelines that are used for standard care. Because of rare disease, we still, it's embarrassing. You sequence a whole genome, the end of it, you still don't understand what variant is causing that individual's disease. So there's lots of potential for the research side to improve that interpretation and solve more rare disease cases, for example.
Yeah, and quicker. So huge benefits. But I've got to get to this really exciting question because I really like it. Genomics has blurred the lines between research, healthcare, and identity. So do you think we've reached a point where sequencing a human genome should be treated as a universal human right? So like clean water or education, or does that over-medicalize life itself? Which I really like this question. It's a big one, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So firstly, I think, right in the early days, again, I'm going to use the 100,000 example because, I spent 10 years doing that. It was made clear, people were worrying, you're going to sequence my genome, you're going to predict my future. And it's made very clear, no, we're not doing that. Genomics England was managed through a patient panel of 30-something individuals. So we were always being watched by patients, discussing and approving different approaches. There's no point with our current level of knowledge of sequencing and analyzing everybody's genome. We're just not going to learn enough. It's not useful. So the strategy was go for the low-hanging fruit, go for a restricted set of situations where there is enough knowledge. And so that's why the focus was only initially on patients who are ill with unmet clinical need, where for a certain subset of cases, rare disease and some cancers, analyzing that person's genome gave a realistic fraction of cases would you find something that would help improve their clinical care. So that's restrict it to that. That allows you to implement it across your system, across your healthcare system, and then you can build on that. Once you've got the infrastructure in place, you can then start looking at this and saying, well, where else can we sequence genomes to improve healthcare, and do it in that sort of progressive way. And so that's been the approach throughout. The structure, the healthcare implementation of the Genome Medicine Service includes an annual review of what's on the list that you can do. Now, is this going to get to genomes for everybody? The latest sort of project, kind of extension project being done for Genomics England is newborn screening. So the idea is we have babies generally, actually in most countries, I think, get this initial test at birth, heel prick, to check for a certain number of metabolic conditions. Can you do better than that? We know for pediatric rare diseases that many cases you discover a baby has some problem after a few years, and by that time it's already too late. There's damage already been done, and the prospect of that child having a normal life are limited because you didn't understand they had a rare disease early enough. So for those cases, can you find enough of those by sequencing a genome at birth? And so that's the project that's going on right now. Another 100,000 genomes. They've got to, I think, 10,000 so far. And they are finding some cases where essentially their early detection of a rare disease condition where there is an intervention has to be backed by a biochemical test, because, of course, taking a genome and trying to predict something, that's not accurate enough. As I said, you can't predict accurately, but you can do a prediction combined with a biological test to discover if there really is a problem or not. So if that turns out to be healthcare effective, then that would be a justification for sequencing everybody at birth. Of course, once you've got a genome sequence, you can keep it for your lifetime. This is another change to the mentality of healthcare, that the traditional thing is you do a test, you store the result in the electronic records, and you throw the data away. You can sequence the genome once and keep it throughout your lifetime. Of course, there's cancer, but for the general condition of your genome and how it might affect everything, you need to do it once. And the particular opportunity, obviously, particularly as we get older and have more, we're on more drug therapies, is those combinations and being able to predict adverse side effects because of pharmacogenomics. At the moment, we know quite a lot about pharmacogenomics, but of course, when we prescribe as medics a drug, we don't go and check the person's genome first. If you've been sequencing it at birth, you can check it in real time. It's a bioinformatics problem. And so that's one of the biggest opportunities, I think. Once it gets cheap enough and there's a good justification for sequencing at birth, then you're going to get these additional benefits of being able to do real-time checks. Is this treatment good for you as an individual based on these kind of limited things? How far are we going to go with that? We don't, this is where the AI solution to the protein folding problem, really gives me hope that given enough data, AI will get much better at understanding how complicated systems, cells, and groups of cells work together. And then we'll be able to interpret the genome in a much more effective way, but we're not there yet. But there are some benefits from whole genome sequencing. Is it going to be a human right? Well, there's lots of things on the human rights list which are not currently implemented. So I wouldn't say it's the first one to do.
That's a good answer. Thank you. It was a complex question. But yeah, and I think even in the interim, we could have, rather than sequencing everybody, just speeding up the process. So from my own experience, these things can be very slow in healthcare system, whereas the technology's there and it can happen quickly. But obviously, the healthcare side isn't quite ready for it yet. So hopefully that will move forward. Last question from the Q&A, and we'll probably have to wrap up. But moving into the European Health Data Space question. So European Health Data Space aims to democratize access. How can we prevent disparities from high-income countries where they benefit more from federated systems than low-resource regions?
Yes, I mean I think one of the biggest effects is if you have a distributed structure, then that means you're going to have a data infrastructure in each country, and the very fact of doing that will help in terms of all of those countries having some equality to access the opportunity to do analysis. Remember that, if you look across the world, the internet is almost everywhere. Suddenly the youth population is, it's much more equal in terms of the ability to access information, access learning tools, become a hacker, work out how to write analysis code. There's people building apps across the world, regardless of the income settings, because the barriers to entry have become much lower. So if you've got an infrastructure in your country for this, as a result of a federated structure, I think that then becomes an easier place for developments in every country. There will be unique healthcare analysis problems in every country. So if the infrastructure is in place, that will help with building up capability on doing that kind of analysis in every country.
Okay, we do have to probably wrap up. Just a last statement from you on ELIXIR specific. So very briefly, what's next for ELIXIR? What are the areas where you see infrastructure becoming more critical in the next decade to move us into the next phase?
Okay, so I would say one of the things is, obviously we mentioned data spaces, but there's also this thing called EOSC, European Open Science Cloud, which has been a kind of a bit like GA4GH in some sense, an association of many different organizations, all interested in making analysis easier. EU projects connected with that, like things like EOSC and Trust, which we're coordinating around trusted environments, trusted processing. But now EOSC is going in a slightly different direction. It's just started creating the EOSC Federation. So this is a much more practical integration. The idea that there is a European node of EOSC, which provides some infrastructure services that you can log in, register, upload some data, do some analysis in. Now we have all these research infrastructures in Europe. Can they be plugged into this infrastructure so that we already are trying to lower the barriers to entry to do data analysis? But if all of these infrastructures were plugged into this infrastructure, that might lower the barriers even more, particularly cross-analysis between different areas, hosted by different infrastructures. ELIXIR is not the only infrastructure. Anyway, so in the first wave of EOSC nodes in this federation, ELIXIR alongside another 3 infrastructures, that we've been picked collectively as one of these 14 nodes, the initial 14 nodes. We're partnering in this with EMBL, which of course is also a node of ELIXIR, as well as us reusing their legal structure. Eurobioimaging, which is another ERIC, and Instruct, which is another ERIC. So the 4 of us are forming this life science node, at least initially, alongside another 13 infrastructure, another 13 nodes, some of which are national nodes with large HPCs and some AI factories, for example. Some are other thematic nodes in different research areas. But this is a real opportunity not only to work more closely together with other research infrastructures, lower barriers, make the data landscape more interoperable with a common AAO login, even going beyond the one that we have, the life science login that ELIXIR has been running for years and has made interoperability easier between resources. So I think that's one of the next stages, and will put us in a good state for the data spaces and providing services in those as well. So that's where I see where we're going right now, actually.
Super. Thank you, Tim. I'm looking forward to that next decade and hopefully working with you for a number of years to achieve some of that. I have the pleasure of obviously working with you daily. Thank you very much for the thoughtful conversation today. Hopefully the audience has found that really interesting. Thank you very much to our audience for joining as well. There are a number of questions that haven't managed to get to. It shows that everyone's very interested in the topic, and hopefully we can move those into one of the next Fireside Chats that the GA4GH organise. So feel free to keep checking the GA4GH website, social media for the next chat that comes soon, and other GA4GH events. But otherwise, to wrap up in time, I'll just have to say thank you to all the participants and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Serena.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye.